She stood in the hallway of the most expensive house she had ever lived in, holding a single grocery bag, and she couldn't buy bread. Not because the money wasn't there. There was plenty of money, and there was more money in this family than most people would see in 100 lifetimes. There were paintings on these walls worth more than entire city blocks. There were closets full of coats that had never been worn. There was a wine cellar that held bottles older than her grandmother. The credit card in her hand had been declined, and the one in her other pocket had been declined too, and the bank account that her husband had set up for her, the one he called her account, as if it were a generous gift, as if she should thank him every morning for the privilege of being funded, had been emptied, not by accident, not by some banking error, by design. She knew it the moment she looked at her phone and saw the single message from her mother. You are no longer a member of this family's financial affairs. Arrangements have been made accordingly. That was it. No explanation. No warning. Just a cold, clean sentence delivered like a legal notice. Like she was a contractor whose contract had been terminated. Like the baby growing inside her, pressing against her ribs, kicking gently in the way babies do when they don't yet know the world is cruel. Like that baby was simply an inconvenience in a spreadsheet somewhere. She set the grocery bag down on the marble floor. She pressed her back against the wall. She put one hand on her stomach, feeling that soft movement, that small life that had no idea what was happening, and she didn't cry. That's what people don't understand about women like Dr. Elena Marchetti. She didn't cry, she breathed, she thought, and somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion and the loneliness and the ache of a body 7 months pregnant, something ancient and brilliant and entirely unbroken stirred inside her, because they had made a terrible mistake. They had forgotten who she was. Let's go back to where this story really begins. Because to understand how a woman ends up standing alone in a marble hallway with a declined credit card and a baby who doesn't know anything yet, you have to understand everything that came before. You have to understand who Elena was before she became Mrs. Harrington, before she became the quiet, polite, somewhat inconvenient wife that the Harrington family tolerated rather than welcomed. Elena Marchetti grew up in a small university town in northern Italy. Her father was a physics professor. Her mother taught literature at the same university, which meant that Elena spent her childhood surrounded by books on one side of the house and equations on the other, and she never thought that was unusual. That was just what a home was, a place where ideas lived. She was quiet as a child, but not shy. There is a difference, and most people don't understand it. Shy people are afraid of being seen. Elena simply didn't need to be seen to feel whole. She was most alive inside her own mind, tracing the architecture of problems that most adults couldn't begin to approach. By the time she was 14, she had read everything in her father's library twice. By 16, she had begun corresponding by letter, actual handwritten letters, with a computational physicist in Switzerland, who didn't realize for 2 full years that his intellectual sparring partner was a teenage girl. When she finally told him her age, he laughed for a long time. Then he called her father and asked if he could sponsor her attendance at an international symposium in Geneva. And that was the beginning. She studied molecular biology and computational physics simultaneously at the University of Bologna, which was something that made even her professors tilt their heads slightly, as if they were trying to understand how a person could hold 2 such different worlds inside. One mind without the walls between them collapsing. But Elena's mind didn't work that way for her. The worlds weren't different. They were the same world seen from 2 different angles. Life was physics. Physics was life. The mathematics of cellular behavior was simply the universe narrating itself at a very small scale. She did her doctoral work at MIT. She published her first major paper at 26, a study on predictive modeling of cellular mutation patterns that sent genuine ripples through the international research community. By 30, she had been awarded research grants by 3 separate governments. By 32, she was leading a team of 14 scientists across 2 continents, investigating a mechanism of genetic expression that most researchers had dismissed as theoretically irrelevant. Or she was right, they were wrong. She proved it, and on a cold October morning in Stockholm, at the age of 32, Elena Marchetti stood on a stage in a formal gown her mother had helped her choose over a video call, and she accepted the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine with a calm, precise speech that made 3 members of the audience cry. She went home the next morning. She had work to do. She met Daniel Harrington 14 months after Stockholm, at a charity gala in London that she had attended because her university had asked her to represent their research department, and she hadn't known how to say no politely. She didn't enjoy galas. She found them noisy in all the wrong ways, loud with small talk, quiet on anything that mattered. But Daniel was different. Or at least, he seemed different. He was tall in the way that men with money often are not. Just physically tall, but occupying space as if the air around him had agreed to make room. He was handsome in a practiced, polished way. Good job, good watch. The kind of smile that had been calibrated over years to land at exactly the right moment. He found her at the edge of the room, where she was nursing a glass of sparkling water, and pretending to read the program. And he said something that surprised her. He didn't compliment her appearance. He asked about her research, not in the vague, patronizing way that men at galas sometimes did. Oh, so you're a scientist. How fascinating. What kind of science? But with specific, pointed curiosity. He had read her Nobel lecture. Had questions about the practical applications of her work. He wanted to understand the commercial implications of predictive cellular modeling in pharmaceutical development. Later she would understand that this was a sales technique. Daniel was always, at his core, selling something. He had learned early in life that the fastest way to a smart person's heart was to make them feel truly heard, and he was very good at it. But in that moment, standing at the edge of a noisy room, in London, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt interesting to someone who wasn't a fellow scientist. They talked for 2 hours. He asked for her number. She gave it to him. They dated for 8 months, and during those 8 months, Daniel Harrington was, by any observable measure, extraordinary. He was attentive without being suffocating. He traveled to wherever she was, adapting his schedule to hers, which was itself unusual enough to feel meaningful. He read papers she recommended. He sat through presentations she gave at conferences and asked intelligent questions afterward. He cooked for her on Sunday mornings when they were in the same city, which happened more and more frequently as the months went on. He told her he loved her on a rainy evening in Paris, sitting across from her at a small table near the window of a restaurant he had chosen because it was quiet enough to have a real conversation. He said it simply, without theater, and she believed him. What she didn't know, what she had no reason yet to know, was that behind the warmth and the attentiveness and the Sunday morning eggs, there was a calculation running. There was always a calculation running with Daniel. It was how he had been raised. The Harrington family ran one of the oldest private investment firms in the United Kingdom. 3 generations of careful, aggressive, sometimes ruthless wealth management. They were not old aristocracy. They were something more modern and, in some ways, more dangerous. They were people who understood that money was not inherited so much as it was engineered, and they had been engineering it for 70 years with the kind of single-minded dedication that left very little room for anything else. Daniel's father, Richard Harrington, was a man who measured everything in returns. His mother, Margaret, was the real architect of the family's social strategy. She had married into the family at 22 and had spent 40 years building the structure of their reputation with the same precision that Elena brought to cellular models. She understood image, she understood alliances, and she understood, immediately and instinctively, that her son's new girlfriend was a disruption to both. The first time Elena met Margaret Harrington, they shook hands at a dinner in the family's country estate outside London, and Margaret smiled with her mouth and said all the right things. And Elena, whose mind was usually so finely tuned to pattern and evidence, missed it completely. She was happy. Happiness makes you miss things. They married 9 months later in a small ceremony that Elena had wanted, and Margaret had quietly Elena wore an ivory dress she had bought herself. Her parents flew in from Italy. A PhD advisor, now 73, cried during the vows. But it was, by Elena's measure, a perfect day. The first year of marriage was not perfect, but it was good. Daniel traveled constantly for work. The investment firm demanded it, and Elena continued her research. Now based out of a private laboratory facility that her Nobel laureate status had helped her secure funding for. They lived in the Harrington family's London townhouse, which was beautiful and vast and faintly oppressive, but Elena told herself that was just an adjustment. New spaces took time to feel like home. The problems began slowly, the way the worst problems always do. Not with a bang. With a series of small, quiet concessions that each seemed reasonable in isolation. It started with money, Daniel suggested, gently, reasonably, with that practiced smile that since they were married now, it made more sense for their finances to be managed together. The Harrington family used a particular wealth management structure that all members of the family participated in. It was simpler, he said, more efficient. She should close her personal accounts and use the family structure instead. He set up an account for her. She could access it any time. She had a credit card. It was generous. She hesitated. Something in her, some old instinct that she had developed over years of navigating institutions that didn't always have her interests at heart, tightened slightly. But Daniel was her husband. She loved him. She trusted him. And honestly, she had never particularly cared about money. She cared about her work. As long as the research was funded, the rest was details, so she signed the papers. Then came the suggestion about her job title, not a suggestion to quit. Daniel was careful about that. He never suggested she quit, but a suggestion that perhaps the way her role was described publicly might be ... adjusted. The Nobel Prize was wonderful, obviously, but when the family attended public functions, it sometimes created an imbalance. People focused on her. Conversations were redirected toward her work in ways that could feel, he said, like they overshadowed the family's own considerable reputation. Would she consider, at social events, perhaps presenting herself more simply, as his wife first? She had looked at him for a long moment when he said that. He laughed slightly. He backtracked. He said he wasn't asking her to hide anything. Obviously that would be absurd. He was just saying that at certain events, a quieter approach might be more ... cohesive. She'll let it go. She shouldn't have let it go by the second year. The small concessions had accumulated into something that didn't have a clean name but had a very clear shape. Elena had reduced her public profile. She still ran her laboratory, but she had stopped attending international conferences, telling herself she simply didn't have time, ignoring the fact that the reason she didn't have time was that the family's social calendar had become something she was required to participate in. Long weekends at the country estate, charity dinners, weekend parties with people whose names she could never quite remember. Margaret had, over these 2 years, conducted a masterclass in self-control. She never attacked Elena directly. She was always warm, in exactly the right measure, warm enough to seem generous, not warm enough to seem like she actually cared. She redirected conversations. She excluded Elena from discussions that she should have been part of. She told stories at dinner about Daniel's previous girlfriends in ways that were framed as fond memory but functioned as comparison. She commented on Elena's choices, her clothing, her hair, the way she decorated her side of the bedroom, with observations that were technically compliments but functioned as critiques. How interesting that you chose that. Most people would have gone with something more traditional, but then you've always been so individual, haven't you, darling? Elena was a scientist. She recognized gaslighting when it was systematic enough, but she was also in love, and she was also pregnant. Now they had found out in the spring, and Daniel had held her in the kitchen and cried, and for a moment, everything felt real again, felt like the man she had fallen in love with at the edge of that noisy room in London. And she told herself that family dynamics were complex and that she was adjusting and that it would get better. She told her mother on a phone call one Sunday evening, speaking Italian the way she always did when she wanted the words to feel like home, that she was a little lonely. Her mother listened without interrupting, which is what good mothers do, and then she said very quietly, "Me, Filia. You have never needed anyone to define you. Don't start now." Elena thanked her. She hung up. She put her hand on her stomach and felt the baby move. The message from Margaret came on a Tuesday morning in November, when Elena was 7 months pregnant and standing in the kitchen of the Harrington townhouse trying to figure out what she actually wanted to eat, which was a task that had become surprisingly complicated because everything smelled wrong on her back. Hurt, and she hadn't slept well in 3 weeks. She read it once, then again. Then she put her phone face down on the counter and stood very still for approximately 45 seconds. "You are no longer a member of this family's financial affairs. Arrangements have been made accordingly." She checked the credit card. Declined. She checked the account. Empty, not overdrawn, empty. Transferred out. Clean. She picked up her phone and called Daniel. He answered on the 3rd ring, which told her something. 3 rings means you saw the name, you considered not answering. And then you answered anyway because you decided the situation required management. Elena Daniel, she kept her voice level. This was something she had always been able to do, keep her voice level when everything inside her was not. It was a skill she had developed in academic settings where the cost of showing emotion was the perception of irrationality, and she had paid that price enough times to learn better. "I received a message from your mother this morning. I'd like to understand what's happened." There was a pause. Not a confused pause, a prepared one. "We need to talk about some things," he said. "I was going to call you. I'd prefer to talk in person. When will you be home?" Another pause. Longer this time. I'm not coming back to the townhouse tonight, Elena. I'm staying at the estate. She understood, in that moment, with the precision of a mind that had been trained to recognize patterns even when recognizing them was painful, exactly what was happening. This was not an impulsive act. This had been planned. The message from Margaret was not the beginning of something. It was the announcement of something that had already been decided. I see, she said. We can meet on Thursday. There will be a solicitor present. Of course there will, she said, and she was surprised to hear something almost like amusement in her own voice. Thursday is fine. She hung up. She picked up the grocery bag she had set down earlier. She looked around the marble hallway of a house that had never felt like hers, with its paintings she hadn't chosen and its cold light and its smell of old money. And she thought very clearly about what she needed to do next. She needed to eat. She needed to sleep. And then she needed to make some phone calls. What the Harrington family did not know, what they had apparently never bothered to find out, which said something extraordinary about their arrogance, was the shape of Elena Marchetti's financial reality. They knew about the Nobel Prize. Of course they knew. Margaret had mentioned it at dinner parties with the tone of someone displaying a slightly unusual ornament. Our Elena is quite the scientist. She won a Nobel, you know. Yes, the Nobel. Quite something. As if it were a nice trophy she had collected at a school sports day. What they had not done, what they had simply never thought to do, because they could not conceive of a reality in which the quiet, Italian woman their son had married was anything other than a clever girl who had gotten lucky in a laboratory, was look at what the Nobel Prize actually meant. Financially, professionally, structurally. The Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine comes with a prize sum. In the year Elena received hers, that sum was 11 million Swedish kronor. She had not spent it, she had invested it, quietly and intelligently, on the advice of a financial advisor in Zurich who was very good at his job and absolutely not connected to the Harrington family in any way. That investment had grown, over 3 years, in ways that would have impressed even Richard Harrington, but that was only the beginning. Because the research that had won Elena the Nobel Prize had a practical application. She had known it for years. The predictive cellular modeling work, the mechanism of genetic expression that everyone else had dismissed and she had proven real, had implications for pharmaceutical drug development that were, frankly, revolutionary. The ability to predict with high accuracy how a specific type of cell would respond to a specific compound before any clinical trial was conducted would not simply improve drug development, it would restructure it entirely. It would cut development timeline by years. It would eliminate entire categories of failure. It would save pharmaceutical companies billions of dollars, and it would save patients' lives in numbers that were, when you work through the mathematics, difficult to contemplate without feeling something. Elena had spent 4 years after Stockholm quietly building the infrastructure to bring this application to market, not publicly, not loudly. She wasn't interested in announcements. She was interested in results. She had licensed core components of the technology to 3 pharmaceutical companies under non-disclosure agreements. She had formed a private company, registered in Switzerland, that held the intellectual property. She had taken on 2 silent investors, a sovereign wealth fund and a technology venture group, whose combined commitment was substantial enough that the word substantial felt entirely inadequate. She had done all of this quietly. From her laboratory, in the hours between the Harrington family dinners and the charity galas and the weekends at the country estate, she had signed documents and taken calls and attended small, private meetings and built, brick by quiet brick, a structure of professional and financial independence that had nothing to do with the Harrington family accounts and never had. She had not told Daniel. She had tried twice, in the early months of their marriage, to explain what she was working on, not just the science but the commercial architecture she was building around it. He had listened with the particular quality of attention that she had learned to recognize as performance. He heard the words, but didn't absorb them. He was interested in her as a concept, the Nobel laureate wife, but not in the actual texture of her work. And somewhere along the way, between the social dinners and the asset restructuring and the quiet erosion of the life she had built before him, she had stopped trying to explain and simply continued building. The morning she received Margaret's message, the private company Elena had registered in Switzerland, Marchetti Biosciences AG, had a valuation, confirmed by independent audit 6 weeks earlier, of approximately 420 million euros. 420 million euros, while Margaret Harrington, transferred zero from a household account, and sent a 2-sentence message about financial arrangements. She almost laughed when she thought about it. 7 months pregnant, alone in a marble hallway, and the woman who had just cut off her credit card did not know that she was standing inside a building owned by someone who could have bought it twice over without noticing. Elena's first phone call that Tuesday morning was to her legal team. She had a legal team. This was also something the Harringtons did not know. Not the family solicitors who had handled her marriage contract. She now understood, naive about that. She had trusted Daniel's assurances that the standard Harrington prenuptial arrangements were just formality, just what everyone does but her own team. A partner at a London firm who specialized in intellectual property and corporate law, and 2 associates in Zurich who managed the Swiss corporate structure. She called the London partner first. His name was Oliver Chun, and he had the particular quality that Elena valued most in any person. He was direct. "They've blocked your access to the household accounts," he said, when she had explained. "Entirely. I also appear to have been removed from the family's financial structure. And you're 7 months pregnant, correct? Right?" She could hear him writing. Oliver always wrote during course. He said it helped him think. "Elena, I want to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it completely honestly, regardless of how it sounds, of course. Is anything materially changed in your personal financial situation as a result of what the Harringtons have done this morning?" A pause then. "No, I mean structurally changed. In terms of your ability to fund your living expenses, your medical care, your research operations, Oliver." She stopped him. "No, nothing has materially changed. The Harrington household account was, in honest terms, the least significant financial resource I have access to." There was a brief silence. "Right," he said again, and she could hear the slight recalibration happening. The way very smart people sound when they're absorbing information that changes the shape of a problem. "Good. That's good. Now here's what I think we should consider, ... Thursday came with grey London skies and the smell of rain on cold pavement, and Elena dressed carefully, not in the kind of clothes she wore to Harrington family events. She had spent 2 years in those clothes. In the cashmere and the understudded jewelry and the appropriate heels, and she was done with that. No. She wore a deep charcoal blazer over a simple dark dress, her hair pulled back cleanly the way she wore it in her laboratory. She wore the pearl earrings her mother had given her when she received her PhD. She wore no other jewelry. She arrived at the solicitor's office 8 minutes early and found Daniel and Margaret already there, which meant they had been there for at least 15 minutes, which meant they wanted the psychological advantage of the room. She noted this without particular emotion and sat down across from them at the conference table with the straightness of spine that she had carried onto. The stage in Stockholm 2.5 years ago, the solicitor was a man named Greaves. He was brisk and efficient and clearly more comfortable with the Harringtons than with her, which also told her things. The proposal they had prepared was comprehensive in its unpleasantness. Daniel wanted a legal separation. The prenuptial agreement, as structured, meant that Elena would receive a one-time settlement that amounted to what the Harrington family considered generous and what Oliver Chun had, when he reviewed the original document at Elena's belated request, described as structured specifically to minimize any long-term obligation. The townhouse would return to the family. She would be provided with temporary accommodation of the family's choosing. She would receive a monthly allowance for the duration of the pregnancy, and for 6 months postpartum custody arrangements for the child would be discussed. Margaret sat slightly behind Daniel and to the left, which was the precise position from which she had always conducted her influence, present but not technically central, guiding without being seen to guide. She was wearing a pale grey suit and a composed expression, and she looked at Elena with the specific kind of compassion that contains no actual compassion. The look that says, "I pity you, and I am enjoying the fact that I pity you." When Greaves finished presenting the terms, he folded his hands and looked at Elena and said, "We'd like to give you time to review the documentation, of course, and to engage your own legal representation I have legal representation," Elena said. A slight pause. Daniel's expression shifted fractionally. "Of course," said Greaves. "If you'd like to communicate through, I also have some information I'd like to share with you," Elena said. "Before we go any further with the terms you've described." She placed a document on the table, a single document, printed cleanly on plain white paper, that her legal team had prepared the previous day. She slid it across the table to Daniel. He picked it up. He read the first paragraph, then he read it again. "What is this?" he said. "It's a summary financial statement," Elena said. "Of my personal assets and corporate holdings," Oliver thought. It would be useful to have in the room. Daniel read it again. His face had changed. The practiced composure had shifted into something less managed, less performed. Margaret leaned forward slightly, and Daniel turned the page toward her. And Elena watched Margaret Harrington read the numbers on that page with the particular pleasure of watching a person discover that the floor they thought was solid was, in fact, not there. The silence lasted a remarkably long time. This is ... Greaves began, then stopped. He was looking at the document now too. This valuation, are these figures current? Audited 6 weeks ago, Elena said. I can provide the full audit documentation, if that would help. 400 Daniel started. And 20 million euros, Elena said calmly. Yes, Margaret's composure, that 40-year masterpiece of careful construction, developed a crack. It was small, barely visible, but Elena saw it. She had spent 2 years studying Margaret's face for exactly this kind of information, and she did not miss it. That's not possible, Margaret said. I understand why you might think that, Elena said. You didn't look. That's understandable. Most people don't look very hard at things they've decided they've already understood. You decided what I was a long time ago. The quiet Italian scientist. The inconvenient wife with the nice Nobel trophy. You stopped looking after that. She paused, briefly. That was a mistake. The room was extraordinarily quiet. The settlement you've proposed, Elena continued, as if she were continuing a seminar, as if she were presenting research findings to a slightly slow-moving audience, is based on a premise that is incorrect. The premise is that I need you. I've never needed you. I have more financial resources than this family has, liquid assets at this moment. I suspect you can verify that if you check your current account positions against the corporate debt you refinanced last year. Daniel flinched. Margaret went very still. Elena had done her research. Oliver's team had done their research. The Harrington investment firm was beneath its very impressive surface, operating under a degree of leverage that would have alarmed their clients if those clients had known. A significant refinancing deal had gone wrong 18 months ago. They had restructured quietly, but the pressure remained. This was not a family in crisis, but it was a family that could not afford a public scandal of any kind. The child, Elena said, is my child. Any custody arrangement will reflect that. My legal team will be in touch with yours about terms. Expect they will be straightforward. She stood, at 7 months pregnant. Standing carried its own particular kind of dignity, the unmistakable weight of a life she was carrying. The physical proof of everything they had tried to reduce her to. I'll be leaving the townhouse. I've arranged accommodation of my own. She picked up her bag. Elena, Daniel said, and for the first time that day, there was something in his voice that sounded like the man she had married. Something that sounded almost Rio. I didn't know. She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. I know you didn't, she said. You never thought to look. She moved into a penthouse apartment in Kensington that she had quietly leased 2 months earlier, before any of this had happened. Because she had been paying attention to the pattern, even when she was telling herself she was still adjusting. The apartment was high and light and full of clean air and the absence of other people's history. She had her books shipped from storage. She had her laboratory notes organized into a room she used as a second office. She set up the baby's room with simple, beautiful things in soft colors, and she did it herself, slowly, over a weekend, resting when she needed to rest, or her mother flew in from Italy and stayed for 2 weeks and cooked extraordinary food and didn't ask many questions and simply filled the apartment with warmth and the sound of a woman who had raised a daughter to know her own value. Elena worked. This was what she had always done when the world got complicated. She worked. Pharmaceutical licensing negotiations were reaching a critical phase. One of her partners was moving toward a full acquisition offer for Marchetti Biosciences AG, which meant that the 420 million euro valuation was almost certainly going to look conservative within the next 18 months. She attended meetings and made decisions and reviewed documents and felt, with every passing day, more like herself. She felt more like herself than she had in 2 years. The baby came on a Tuesday, 4 weeks early but healthy, small and insistent, and absolutely herself from the very first moment. Elena held her daughter in the hospital room while her mother sat in the chair by the window crying the specific happy terrified tears of new grandmothers. And she looked at this person who had been growing inside her through all of it, through the marble hallways and the family dinners and the declined credit cards and the Thursday meeting and all the rest of it, and she was overwhelmed by a love So complete and structurally sound that it felt like a proof of something, like something she could stand on. She named her Mia, after no one in the Harrington family, after no tradition or obligation. She named her Mia because it meant mine, and she meant it not possessively but protectively, in the way of a person who understood the importance of belonging somewhere that was real. 3 months later, the acquisition offer came in. It came from one of the largest pharmaceutical corporations in the world. A company whose name you would recognize, whose products were in medicine cabinets in 130 countries. They wanted to acquire Marchetti Biosciences AG outright. They wanted the technology, the patents, the research pipeline, the entire structure that Elena had built in the quiet. Margins of 2 years of marble hallways and family dinners. The offer was 850 million euros. Oliver called her on a Monday morning while she was feeding Mia, and he read her the number and she said HM, in the way she always said HM when a result confirmed what she had predicted but still satisfied her. Do you want to counter? He asked as she said, tell them 950, and I want the research continuity provisions I outlined last week. The team stays. The laboratory independence clause stands non-negotiable, and if they push back, they won't, she said. They need this more than I need them. They know that. They didn't push back. The news became public 6 weeks later. The acquisition of Marchetti Biosciences AG for 950 million euros, just over $1 billion at current exchange, was announced in a joint press release that described Elena as a pioneering scientist and entrepreneur whose transformative research represents a generational advance in pharmaceutical development. Her photograph was on the front page of the Financial Times. Her name was in articles in 17 countries. It was a Tuesday. She read the coverage at the kitchen table in Kensington while Mia slept in the next room, and she drank her coffee, and thought about the fact that somewhere in the world, Margaret Harrington was also reading these articles and understanding, with the specific whole clarity of a woman who prided herself on never missing anything. Precisely how comprehensively she had missed everything. She received a call from Daniel that afternoon. She looked at his name on her phone screen for a moment, and then she answered it, because she was not a person who avoided difficult things. I read the news, he said. Yes, Elena, .. Book quotes a long pause. I owe you an apology. Several apologies. For things that I don't have adequate words for. She was quiet for a moment. She could hear in his voice that he meant it, or at least some real portion of him meant it, and she had never been the kind of person who derived satisfaction from other people's suffering, even people who had caused her their own. I know, she said. I didn't value you correctly. I allowed my family to influence how I treated you in ways that were wrong. And while you were pregnant, his voice broke slightly. Slightly. That was inexcusable. Yes, she said simply. Not as a wound. As a fact. I'd like to be in Mia's life, he said. If you'll allow it, if you'll consider it. I understand I have no standing to demand anything. Elena looked out the window at the grey London sky. She thought about Mia sleeping in the next room, about the way she curled her small fist near her face when she slept, about the fact that whatever Daniel was or wasn't, he was that child's father, and the child was not the repository for anyone's grief. You have no standing to demand, she agreed. But I will consider it. For Mia's sake. You'll work with my legal team on terms, and those terms will include certain conditions, and you'll honor them, of course. And Daniel, she paused. I want you to understand something. Not for me, for you. A breath. The mistake your family made was not tactical. It wasn't about money or leverage or negotiation. Your mother looked at me and decided what I was based on what she expected to find. She stopped asking questions the moment she thought she had an answer. That's not how you understand the world. That's how you miss it. It was quiet for a long moment. I know, he said. I know that now. The legal proceedings concluded 7 months after that Thursday meeting at Greaves's office. Elena's team had been thorough and unhurried and entirely unimpressed by the Harrington family solicitor's various attempts at pressure and delay, because pressure and delay are only effective against people who are running out of time or money, and Elena had an abundance of both. The settlement was, by any reasonable measure, a complete and humiliating defeat for the Harrington family's original position. Elena retained full primary custody of Mia, with structured and supervised access for Daniel that would be reviewed as the circumstances evolved. She received a formal acknowledgement, legally documented, that she had been wrongfully excluded from financial resources during her pregnancy, a document that her team had required and the Harrington solicitors had resisted, and eventually, under precisely the kind of quiet, relentless pressure that Elena had learned to apply over years of working in institutional environments. Accepted. She waived the financial settlement entirely. She made a point of that. She did not want their money, and she wanted it formally on the record that she did not want their money. Because money was the only language to Harrington. Family spoke fluently, and she wanted to say something in that language that they would understand perfectly and never forget. She gave a donation to 3 research institutions that same month. One in Bologna, where her father had taught. One in Cambridge, where she had spent 2 years postdoctoral research. One in Lagos, a new genomics institute whose director she had met at a conference years ago and whose work she believed in deeply. The combined donation was significant enough that all 3 institutions named facilities after her. Margaret Harrington sent a letter, which arrived at Elena's Kensington apartment on a Wednesday morning, approximately 10 months after the cold. 2 sentences message about financial arrangements. It was handwritten, which was itself a kind of concession. Margaret was not a person who wrote things by hand. Typed documents had lawyers behind them. Handwriting was private, deniable, human. It was not an apology exactly. Margaret was not constitutionally capable of a clean apology in the way that a surgeon might not be constitutionally capable of cutting with their hands uncertain. But it was. Elena read it twice, an acknowledgement, wrapped in careful language, and preserved with enough pride to still be standing, but an acknowledgement. I find that I was mistaken in my assessment of your circumstances and your character. Margaret had written, in a hand so controlled it looked architectural. I hope that in time, and for the sake of Mia, we might find a more constructive understanding. Elena set the letter on her desk. She read it once more. She thought about the 2 years of small concessions and cashmere and marble hallways, and the message about financial arrangements and her daughter, sleeping in the next room, and the 950 million euros and all of it. She wrote back, also by hand. The letter was short. Dear Margaret, thank you for your letter. I accept your acknowledgement in the spirit I believe it was intended. For Mia's sake, I am willing to build something new. It will need to be built on honesty, which is something we have not previously managed. I believe we are both capable of it, Elena. She posted it that afternoon on her way to the laboratory. She was back in the laboratory full-time by the time Mia was 6 months old, which some people found surprising and others found inevitable, depending on how well they knew her. The acquisition had closed. The research team had been integrated. The laboratory independence clause held. She still led the scientific direction, still came in every day if she wanted to. Still had the intellectual freedom. That was the only freedom she had, whoever truly needed. A journalist from a major international publication interviewed her for a long profile that ran the following spring. It was a good profile, thorough and respectful. And the journalist asked, near the end, what Elena thought had been the most significant moment of the past 2 years. Elena considered the question properly, which was the only way she'd considered any question. There was a moment, she said, when I was standing in a hallway holding a grocery bag and my credit card had been declined. And I had a choice about what that moment meant. She paused. I think the most significant thing I did was decide it didn't mean what they wanted it to mean. They wanted it to mean I was dependent. I chose for it to mean that I didn't need them. Those 2 things sound similar, but they're actually very different. The journalist asked what the difference was. Dependency is defined by what you lack, Elena said. Freedom is defined by what you're capable of. I had never actually been dependent on them. I had only allowed them to behave as if I were. The day they removed access to that account, they accidentally removed the one thing that had allowed that fiction to persist. And the fiction fell over. She smiled. I'm actually grateful for the message. In some ways it clarified things. Laboratory was quiet in the evenings after the team had gone home. The way laboratories are quiet, not empty quiet, but thinking quiet. The hum of equipment and the smell of clean surfaces and the rows of samples organized in their beautiful, indifferent precision. Elena often stayed late. She had always been most at home in the quiet of her own mind. And the laboratory was simply the room where that interior quiet had the most company. On an evening in October, exactly 3 years after Stockholm, she was reviewing a data set that one of her junior researchers had flagged as potentially interesting when her phone buzzed with a photograph from her mother. Mia sitting in her grandmother's kitchen in Italy, covered in flour. Apparently in the middle of helping to make pasta, face turned toward the camera with an expression of absolute fierce-eyed delight that Elena recognized because she had seen it in the mirror every day of her professional life. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about the whole way. She thought about the message. She thought about the cold, clean precision of people who think that money is the same thing as power, and that power is the same thing as worth. She thought about how entirely they had misunderstood every meaningful thing. And she thought about the fact that none of it had actually touched her. It had tried to. It had come very close in the long months of cashmere and marble and small concessions. But the deepest part of her, the part that had read everything in her father's library, twice, and written letters to a physicist in Switzerland at the age of 15, and stood on a stage in Stockholm and looked out at a room full of the world's most brilliant people and felt simply ready. That part had remained completely intact. That was the thing about people who try to diminish you. They can clear your bank account. They can remove your name from documents. They can seat you at the wrong end of a table and talk over you and treat you like an ornament and send cold messages about financial arrangements. But they cannot reach into the architecture of what you've built inside yourself. They cannot take back your Nobel Prize. They cannot unprove what you've proven. They cannot make the cellular model stop working. They cannot make the mathematics wrong. They forgot she had a Nobel Prize. They forgot she had a company. They forgot she had a mind. They forgot who she was. And in forgetting, they handed her back everything. Asterisk on the morning that Forbes published their list that year. A researcher on Elena's team, 24 years old, 2 years out of her own PhD, one of the brightest people Elena had worked with in a decade, knocked on the door of Elena's office holding her phone. "Dr. Marchetti," she said, "you're on the list." Elena looked up from her work. "Which list?" "Forbes. Billionaires." You're the young woman smiled, the kind of smile that comes from genuine, uncomplicated delight. "You're on the list." Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the data set on her screen. Then she looked back at her researcher. "Right?" she said. "Thank you." A pause. "Now come and look at this data set. I think there's something in the methylation patterns that we've been misreading." The young woman sat down. They bent over the screen together. Outside the laboratory window, London was bright and cold, and entirely unaware that inside this room, one of the world's most powerful women was doing the thing she loved most in the world, which was looking at something very small and very complicated and understanding it a little better than she had before. Mia was in Italy with her grandmother, covered in flour, laughing. Everything had been returned to its correct position. There is a version of this story that ends with revenge, with Elena standing triumphant over the ruins of the Harrington family's reputation, with Margaret publicly humiliated, with Daniel brought low in ways that satisfy the part of us that wants wrongdoing to have proportional consequences. That version is satisfying in the way of something sweet eaten quickly. But the real ending of Elena's story, the ending that matters, the ending that means something, is not about the Harringtons at all. It is about a woman who knew who she was when the world around her tried to tell her differently. It is about a mind that kept working in the quiet margins of marble hallways and charity dinners. It is about the particular stubbornness of someone who has always understood that their value lives inside them, not in what someone else is willing to give them access to. They cut off every penny. They sent a 2-sentence message. They thought they were ending something. They forgot that you cannot cut off what belongs entirely to someone else. They forgot that she was not, and had never been, what they imagined her to be. They forgot she had a Nobel Prize. But Elena had never forgotten, not for a single day, and that, in the end, was always going to be enough.